Episode 3 of the Thought About It podcast, taking a look at an article called Capitalism Can't Have My Creativity by Jason McBride. Now, going through this article, I'll save you the what I would call rage bait, though that can be a little aggravating to the person that wrote it. Why call it that? Like anything, there needs to be discussion. And when things are framed in terms of capitalism, I often find it really difficult to talk. We kind of all know why, because it's just a hyper polarizing subject where it seems like most people, including myself, if I was to talk about that, would get lost in arguments that don't have an end. They seem like there's no solutions at the end of it. It seems super demotivating. And amongst those by themselves, who feels motivated to go on through the day by dealing with that? So that's why I would call that rage bait. But something I want to say at the start of this discussion is that I do share a lot of views with the author. The problem is the way that it's being framed. Now, when you read the article, if you go through it, you're going to notice a large point that's being made to the bottom of the article is a focus on artificial intelligence. As the title suggests, capitalism can't have my creativity. We can almost certainly assume that this article is going to be about artificial intelligence because of how that would impact your creativity and how trending the topic is right now. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, I have so many problems, but I also take a look at the side of, why are we building this stuff? These tools that I'm using. I'm using AI throughout the day. I'm using code throughout the day. I'm using platforms like social media throughout the day for myself and also talking to other people through my content. I'm using the different platforms to distribute audio, listen to audio. I see the benefits of using this stuff. But I also have a problem with a certain aspect of technology. And that's where me and the author share many views. But I will go as far as saying that the author is talking about capitalism when the author should really be talking about the engineering profession and the individuals that make it up and the individuals who have, in a way, become addicted to the idea of programming and automating and enhancing the world, to use a positive view. But there are individuals in there that are responsible for driving this technological advancement. Now, why I say this is because there is a direct reference to how using artificial intelligence would be benefiting the people who are the owners of it, such as people like Sam Altman. And I would more so classify Sam Altman as being somebody who pertains to the category of people that we would call an engineer or somebody who is fascinated by the subject and any of the subjects that fall inside of it. That's a person that I am not. And I'm a person that has been challenged by those individuals many times throughout my life. And it has been a source of a lot of problems to me personally. And people like myself have grown frustrated with it, which is something that I've seen. I've seen this in workers that aren't people who would be classified as somebody who knows the ins and outs of the terminal, or somebody who knows the ins and outs of physics, or somebody who knows the ins and outs of any subject that would fall into the category of engineering. Now, I mentioned in the introduction of this podcast that I tend to have arguments and problems in this area of talking about engineers. I did not select this article for that. I actually selected it off the title, and I did say that I thought this was going to be about artificial intelligence. Um, that might be a little bit of hindsight bias right there, but it is very much something that uh I did not select it to be able to make an argument, nor would I ever select an article just to be able to throw one of my arguments that are predefined. I'm looking for reading that doesn't, it's not just to challenge me, but something that's interesting. And this article is, if anything, interesting for not so much the content, but showing how a problem is being pinned on one thing when there should perhaps be a focus in another place that is smaller than blaming a whole economic system. Because when we blame a whole economic system, the problem is then, what do we do? Like, what do we go to? And the arguments that I've heard for alternate economic systems, to really quickly touch on that, and then I will stay away from the subject of that because it's a little bothersome with how much argument has already been done in that area for most people, including myself, is that the alternatives almost never seem to work out, and anything that's proposed really just sounds the same. Um, and it doesn't sound like it leads to something that's any healthier, and any signs of something that gets close to something that's different almost always seems like dictatorship. And it always seems like the list goes on. It's so obviously the attractive position to me would always be, well, let's not make the argument on an economic system. Let's start there. And in trying to find a more positive view of the world outside of this focus, because it is really draining, like in favor of capitalism or against capitalism, that gets old really quick. I feel like almost everybody could relate on that point. Like if you're a full blown communist, if you're a full blown I support capitalism, like both sides, on I can speak for like the capitalism side, like I just don't even want to argue in favor of it, but it doesn't mean I'm against it. And that's a very clear distinction. Something works for me. I just don't have the energy or the desire to argue in favor of it, but I'm also listening to arguments against, and I can clearly see where the value lies and also where the problem starts. So that's all I want to say on that, because that is a point that gets lost in arguments like that, and therefore why the whole podcast will not be on the problems of capitalism or the benefits of capitalism, because it's not even a discussion that's possible in person. And who would I be to make a podcast driving a point on that? Why don't I use something that actually works in discussion? And something that works in discussion is talking about something smaller that's more tangible. Right there is where you meet people who are willing to chat. Somebody who is not willing to chat about problems that are smaller, even one step down from an economic system, would be who knows what. But a group of people as large as engineers in the world would filter in a size of a sizable focus that's large enough to consider one step down for the purpose of chatting. Now, going right back to the title, Capitalism can't have my creativity by Jason McBride. The A big answer that was provided in the article would be to stop using artificial intelligence. And that phrase of to stop using is something that showed up throughout the article. And it looks like that's what the driver was to attach this idea to capitalism, as if it's a revolt against um, the ideas that are prevailing on whatever is current. And number one, capitalism is not whatever is current and prevailing, and then you just attach everything to that. That is outside the discussion. But what is prevailing is something that is quite important, and what is prevailing is we are in a hyper tech environment everywhere in the world outside of the places that are completely contained for reasons that we do not want to replicate. And I am in no way advocating that we become those places. And I didn't even think about that, but I'm sure that there are similarities in there. I'm in no way advocating that we become those places. That would be an extreme argument. But what I do look at is something that ties back to this whole idea of tying things to capitalism and anti-capitalism is when you're looking at a problem, you know, there are things like technology, which I find fantastic. As I mentioned, I use technology, social media. I depend on it for supply and demand side. And that's just because it's an easy way to say that. I demand things from it and I use it for the things that I do. And why that's important, you know? I use it, I demand, and I supply from it. But I'm not making a point on the prevailing. And what I mean by that is engineers, and why I focus them in this chat, is that engineers do create these visions for society. Now, right away, I start to think, well, this is a point that does tie into the people who are powerful, who are engineers, like Sam Altman, and that might be like, okay, this author has hit the nail on the head here to blame capitalism. But I see Sam Altman, as I said, as a person falling in the category of engineers. He's a person who became very successful because of the focus of society and him having a project that is obviously good enough to become a huge success. Now, whether or not that's the best project, etc., that's a tech talk. But to ask a question like that leads into the discussion that I'm having, where how many people are fascinated and constantly talking about tech? That answer is very different from how many people are proposing a future that's based on tech, or proposing that the world in the future is going to be radically different because of it. Now, those are two very different things to be doing. I wrote some comments and I did talk about this on the podcast already, to where I said pitching a sci-fi future is something that's highly undesirable for a lot of people, but especially me. That's something that sounds more like it is a desire or a dream of a certain group of people. And I would say that's an engineer who would want that. But it's not all engineers. But amongst those individuals, that's who it would be. And that might contain groups containing other people, like business people. I'm sure there's somebody who has interests that make them want that, or there's some people who just want that. They just have those interests. Now, saying that, I find that to be the problem. Specifically, by that, what I'm talking about is people who are using artificial intelligence or technology, coding, etc., to try to create a vision and future that is radically different. Because when you do post or comment or support things, you should be posting and supporting whatever you would like. There's something I don't like in this article, and it tends to fall in the category of people staging a revolution against a idea. Now, saying to somebody you should stop doing this for political motive is sort of starts to get into the area of being as exciting as a political contribution. I don't want to make my whole life about a political contribution, but I do want to make sure that the life that I'm living is something that's highly motivating. And for that to be the case, I need to talk about things that are relevant and that can be fixed. And something that can be relevant and fixed, or something that can be fixed that's relevant, is engineers who talk about tech as if it's the only thing that matters. That is something that's supported by such a large group of people for a considerable amount of time that it has driven so many people to adopt those same views. Because at a certain point, and this is my view, that at a certain point there's so much support for something to where if you're not on board with it, you sound like a weirdo. Now that might be cute and funny, but who's gonna say I don't use AI? It might sound a little trendy now, but that could be a good sign. Now, the title, Capitalism Can't Have My Creativity. Now, this title makes more sense to me if it was to say engineers can't have my creativity. That's kind of interesting because I always thought that engineers were some of the most anti capitalist individuals. Far and part, there's a group that's disrupting, and there's a group that is uh, usually saying stuff that is at least not in favor of capitalism or not standing on it to make a point. That sorry, I'm drinking coffee, but that that would be that group of individuals, which is not my main point because that would be a suspicion based on anecdotal, and I know that I don't run into enough people to be able to know that for sure. Because who knows if everybody's even publishing online. But I can tell you that the group of business people who you would really think of as capitalism, people who are in favor of business, like ownership of a company, which by the way is something that everybody has. You know, a lot of people own companies. Let's start with that. Your share is small, but you do own that company. And in the technicalities of that, of course, the ETFs that you purchase through vote those shares for your best interest, or the interest, you might say, though it might not even be true, depending on the ETF, that it's for the person with the highest holdings. And that just reflects the same old thing that you're arguing. I'm arguing that the problem is not ownership. Ownership actually wants people to be successful, in my view, though that might be a modern thing. What is it that gets you demotivated at work, that drains you at work, and that feels exploitative at work? All definitions of a capitalist system by somebody who is anti-capitalism. To me, that sounds like the algorithms. To me, that sounds like the numbers on screens called KPIs. But more than KPIs, because right there is a business term. Those numbers that have data tracking in the drive-through lane that is making you move. Right there is data. Right there is computers. Right there is security cameras. It's a performance. It's making you move. I have a better argument against that than a system of ownership that wants to be better if you were to focus Apple versus Microsoft. I want to make everything to do with my organization better. By definition, you need to be happier, and no part of me telling you to, without actually making you feel that inside, is going to make you talk about my Apple better, and it's not going to make you happy to do your best work. Not to mention, why would you be providing me your best work when we all know you could make the decision to follow other people's decision that may have not gotten hired there if they, like, your decision to not provide your best work, your decision to not innovate, your decision to not be motivated, to talk positively, to make the company the thing that made it known. Because that is not always happening. That takes people. People are companies. We can get into the technicalities of the residual value that gets left over time. Perhaps residual isn't the best word. The accumulating resources that have been left over. And I think a word is slipping my mind right now. But what I do know that is called, it's called assets. And what that is the capital and the technology and the culture, some might argue. And you're going to see a plethora of things that are considered this. These are the things that get left over in these companies. And they're what start to define the companies. But what can change that overnight, though that's considered an asset, is people. And that's extremely important, because all these systems and processes that can be created would be to protect what is owned by that company, which doesn't have to sound negative, and that's why I stay away from it, because it's so boring that it's negative in my view. It's not that it's negative, it's just that it's so boring and demotivating that it feels disgusting. I agree with you on that. Now, people, you can go into work and sabotage a company. I don't doubt it. And I think that you could even sabotage a country. Heck, you could probably sabotage the world. Do I think that that would be almost difficult for people to want to do? Yes. And the reason why I say that is because there's so much that comes before that that's available for you to get excited, that is triggered by watching something as simple as a YouTube video. Who wants to ignore everything in life that is like potentially exciting, that motivates them or gets them interested in something? That's cute. I think ruining the world, that one might not even be able to be possible if you just did it by accident. But let's say you could, just like you could ruin a company. You'd start talking negatively in a way that's toxic. You'd be popular, but you'd also be toxic at the same time. What does that do? Well, just like this argument about technology and people thumping a Bible on a conclusion, not a fact. A fact is that technology is fantastic. The conclusion of how important that technology is and where it should be applied, how about let's start talking about engineers instead of capitalism? Now, why I say talk about engineers instead of capitalism? We have it right there. It's a beautiful discussion about engineers being fantastic, but not being the ones that should be sitting and occupying all the seats at a director's table. And if anybody doesn't understand what a director is, step out of business for a second and just think about directing. You do this, you do that. You're the person who's basically telling everything what to do. Because believe it or not, that has to come from somewhere. So that is what the board of directors, that table is easily understood by that. They are the top level ones that say, this is the direction we're going. And there's usually a share of how many people sit there. So it's a very beautiful image for this discussion. Imagine that's all engineers. How many companies that are modern today that were called or are called disruptive are the same exact thing that's already existed, but that board of directors is made up by people who see things the same as engineers? How many are the original companies themselves that have adopted every view that an engineer has? There's very little that goes against the narratives and the views of where the future is going. Heck, even investors are seeing that too. I find very little challenging perspectives in big money against AI being the future, because there are very much arguments in favor of that, of an anti AI future. And it's not far fetched. An educated individual can do how much in the flash of a second for themselves that a person would spend 2 weeks. They might never even ask the right question without the right education. Somebody might argue that education is going to provide you something that AI can never provide you. And even if you were to plug it into your brain, that unless you were to become completely controlled by it, and even then, whose direction are you going to be plugging in? Somebody has to say the decision of where to head. That's the kind of sci-fi vision that I just don't focus on, and I don't get excited by that. It is intriguing, though. It is intriguing discussion. I don't engage with it because I don't really think about it. But now that I talk about it, this is intriguing. You'd be what? Buying a perspective. I want to buy the Elon Musk package, plug it in. That's the direction that I'm headed. This is the kind of discussion that is obviously slightly controversial in terms of what engineers are usually talking about. Got it. Let me talk about something a little bit more understanding so you know I'm not just a crackpot here that's uh, not understanding engineers at all. How about most engineers today know there's problems in AI? And a good thing that they've also realized that a lot of their jobs would be at risk before many other areas if AI was perfect. This is where we all give hugs, okay? So this is also an area that I see eye to eye with the people that even this author of this blog article called Capitalism Can't Have My Creativity, I'm hugging everybody here. Okay, I see the same as the author, just a different way. I also see the same as engineers, who I think are being blamed here. That doesn't mean I share every view though. And it's the tech focus that I think is important. Tech is something that liberates the average person. It has provided me more intelligence and capability about myself, but it's the core technology that's done that. The future and the way that it's been applied, that's interesting. Because the future and the vision, like a chatbot, okay, things like this, how important is the chatbot going to be? How many decisions do we make that completely factor in AI? Who's making decisions right now on their career that's factoring that? How many people have made job decisions? I, for one, work in a kitchen, and why I'm confident about a certain role in the kitchen is because of a sense of security against that. There's one factor that contributes to a whole reason why I love working in the kitchen. But it did contribute to that as well. But one of the biggest points that I took from this article is obviously that literally right in the title, Capitalism Can't Have My Creativity, you could switch a word like that to something that is a lower category than capitalism. Engineer. Engineering can't have my creativity, which is actually a very powerful title. And the article that I would write would be this: engineers have been fascinated with technology. Their fascination with technology has led to a world and producing things that has, yes, advanced me. But the talk and the debate that has been done while their fingers are moving is something that has led to great stress in my life. That might be a small flaw. It influences people at the top, the people in power. Those people tend to want to talk to things that are relevant. That hits a single node, which is a single person making a decision of what they support and what they enjoy. Those are interests. Those are very real interests, and they get influence. And just like you can support a company, you can make the decision, I don't see things that way. So knowing that everybody can do that, those interests are real. So there's a lot of people who see that artificial intelligence should be depended on and that you will lend your creativity to artificial intelligence to be able to do something that might say it will have a better result. If you write with me instead of writing that email yourself, you will have a better result. Am I understanding that correctly, or is there something that appeals people to AI even more? Because I think that's where it catches me. The wonder of, should I do this by hand or should I use AI for this? The only way I've been able to get the both best of both worlds is only use it in areas where it's providing a suggestion. I'm almost never using it for end content. I don't think I ever have, actually. I think there's the only times would be when I made like an experimental video that was very intended to just be a AI version of writing that I was doing, and I just stopped it immediately because it was more just a one-time thing that I needed to do to visualize a concept. But I'm using this tool. And I might even say to become more creative. Because AI works, but it sucks. And that's kind of a point that's found in this author's writing, is that you don't need it. But that's very much on the topic of a discussion against an engineer who's saying that it's incredibly useful. It's going to be used everywhere, and every industry is going to need it. It's going to replace jobs, etc. That seems to be the public narrative, right? Engineers at least think that something to do with engineering is so important that if you were to live without it, that you would almost certainly. What's the conclusion down there? If there's no conclusion there, it's quite honest. It's a what I would call a pure engineer, somebody who is just developing technology. The people that are using it use it, and there's no need to sell with saying this is going to disrupt everything and change everything, because those are writers, but they are tapping into interest. And who's supporting that? Who's interested in that view? That those are people. Those are people who enjoy technology, or people are motivated by pushing that sort of stuff. I don't know. Could call that capitalism, I guess. Isn't that more as people in a single profession pushing things to gain power? And that's very little to do with the people at the top. That's why I did draw that reference from Sam Altman to the group of engineers, which is a major point in what I'm talking about in this article. Is that it seems to tie back, to be able to tie this article to capitalism, it has to tie back to the top, because it seems like the anti-capitalism stance is very much against this idea of the top, the people who own, and because the people who own are very different from the people who are directing. Though those people can vote, that they aren't the same people who are actually making those decisions. There is still some decisions there that aren't being made by ownership. but that's a technicality. I won't even get sucked into that discussion. But making the parallel between the engineering crowd and Sam Altman, because that's a simple example that is referenced in the article. Again, Capitalism Can't Have My Creativity by Jason McBride, where I say we need to be calling this, or I would call this, engineering can't have my creativity. Because where I do see the same as this author is that I actually much enjoy the work that I do without AI and without technology. And I think that most of the value that I've created in my life, in terms of even starting this podcast, was stuff that I did without technology. I was sitting and thinking. And to be precise, I was away from technology at the time. I stepped away. And I was living very much a life without technology. Let's not get into the details, ladies and gentlemen, that I know society in general is probably way better because of technology. That's pure technology stuff. Talking about it's the point of this article too, so that's outside of my point. Wherever I got confused in saying that. There is an argument in there, but it feels like I'd get sidetracked. But whatever that was that I was gonna head down is something that I think that I just disagree with the article about anyways. But it can't have my creativity and does it? Because number one, it doesn't have my creativity and again, the whole framing of the article is I think there needs to be a focus on the actual problems. Because as I said, changing an economic system is a very big thing that has an alternative that just doesn't seem attractive. But then the only solution can't be saying I'm pro capitalism because I am like, but that's such a it's not because it's boring, it's just not motivating to me. But it takes you bringing the point up as not using that anti-capitalism stuff. That is politics because you're looking for more views. Because why else would you do that? I'm listening to you if you want to have the discussion. So, in that discussion, I think engineers who are pushing this technology, who push automation, who push AI, who push advancement because they're constantly advancing. It's one thing nobody could argue. Constant optimization, constant work. That is what an engineer does. We want to make stuff better. You might think, well, that sounds like what anybody's trying to do. Yes, but what engineers do is that they're creating stuff that are systems that do things that can replace people or that people can use. It's called technology. Something as simple as a bike, I believe, or something that can like chop a hamburger in half. I think that you could categorize all that as technology because there's some physical engineers and things like that who like design products and things like that. All this stuff. The real argument that I see in this article, it goes against stuff like that and the thought that that is life. Because that is not the focus of business. My focus in business is to be able to profit the most. But it's what I define profit as that is very different. I make the most profit when I'm just the best. It's as simple as that. That would mean that anybody who works with me, anything has to be the best. There's no shortcuts to it. The market is cutthroat, in my opinion. The second I try to take a shortcut, the second that somebody's not happy, the second I skip something and try not to become the best, it's going to get noticed. That is so different from engineering. That is so different from efficiency. Because efficiency, to create a good piece of content, are you going to watch a highly efficient piece of content? Isn't it the opposite? Who's the person who made a piece of content and slowly worked on it over like even a couple days and didn't make the content all at once? Isn't that something that, well, it might lead to something better? I'm not saying that's a process that actually works, because it sounds like you wouldn't be rolling or like rolling on like the creative juices that flow all at once sometimes. But to publish something, to be able to hit a certain amount of views, because more is getting you results, or you have to hit a certain time to post it, or you have to post a certain amount to get views. I mean, what's standing in between you and being viewed by that much? Technology is what allows you to be seen by everybody in the world. That's why technology is not the problem. Who made the algorithms? That is not core technology. That is a view. So we could almost use algorithms and the decisions and the things that you do to do well on an algorithm as a reflection of the engineering perspective that I don't think has to be there, or it's something that needs to be understood as a problem that we need to talk about. Because the title of the article, again, Capitalism Can't Have My Creativity, which sounds like a last straw. It's taken everything from this person. In this person's view, it's draining them of everything. Now think of this algorithm that represents the engineering view. Who's trying to or wants to do everything that I do in a system of some sort? I mean, as a profession, the only one would be engineering, would it not? I don't care if you monetize me. Like, what's the problem with that? I care if you make my only source of income like driving around in a car, and that's based on a number, and my phone crashes and now I can't get any orders because it thinks that I am driving unsteady or driving too fast, and really it's just because my phone was rattling around in my car. It's a stupid example, but it's as simple as that. I'm working at McDonald's. The person at the cash register, have you never noticed somebody who's moving a little too fast for them to even be helpful in a role that's customer facing, and they don't have a natural glide to it? Very clear distinction, by the way. Fast workers, that's exciting. That gets you electric. Somebody who's moving fast and seems like they're plugging numbers into a system, that is how I would define capitalism. But that's not capitalism. That's computers. But I do think those computers are powerful, but what they're being used for is being influenced by engineers. Now that's my argument. Who told those board of directors or any of the managers that were in between that that's the direction you have to go to remain relevant? Well, it's the people that are driving the core narrative there that influence the whole world. Who influences Elon Musk, Altman Fried, who else? Bill Gates. Who are the people who really run the world in terms of perspective on technology? You cannot say that that is a completely free thinking space. There are huge packs of people that follow very core views that are made up of obviously people who try to understand how everybody thinks. But those people, like, see right there, like, kind of contradict myself trying to take a view that is that people at the top have that much of a say. You know, they can have an impact by driving stuff, but it's these engineering views that start to dominate these other areas. And I don't know if the view is that important compared to the engineering part. An engineer can say that their technology is critical, but I don't know if they can say that their view of where the world is going to go is critical, because that's not the study that would be qualified to make that distinction. Where is technology going to go? Well, you could calculate that, but then there's also details and professional opinion. That's fine. But can you guys see what I'm trying to say here? Because it does sound like this. Capitalism can't have my creativity. Engineering can't have my creativity. I want to be nice to the people when I'm working if I'm working at McDonald's. What's getting that car to come back? I can almost guarantee you what built up McDonald's was decisions like that. And people seeing other people work. But more importantly, it was the food, right? Well, what squeezed the food? What squeezed the people from making those decisions? What is that? It looks like a program. And that's not the business, because that goes against my interests. I cannot stand the queues at McDonald's in the drive-through. And they do that to hit good data. Those are systems that are being used. That's technology. To drive more profit. Well, why would they have to install that? You know, who wants numbers like that? Obviously, I want more information about the business as an owner. Everybody is guilty of that. But if we were to take a view, it's that view is toxic. Is it? Or is it installing and developing technology to harvest that information in a way that has nothing to do with business? Business people could give you a report on how their people are doing and convey a certain figure. An engineer would solve that problem by writing code that gets that automatically or tracks that data. That tracking data is what squeezes things. So I think that's a really good place to end that there in terms of the opening of the discussion. Because there's a huge distinction between business and engineering. And it turns into like almost like capitalism and anti-capitalism. And I do think there's so many people in every industry that are adopting these views that sound like Elon Musk, that sound like Sam Altman, that sound like engineers. And then there's some engineers who go against certain ones because it's either just super true or it sounds good, but you you need people. You don't need these conclusions coming from systems, and you don't need to follow a number or automated computer. That actually sounds exactly like what would stop my company from being the best. If you're a machine line and you need to pump out as much stuff as possible, then I'm sure that's where computers would be fantastic. But you are not following those things at all. So, what's the argument for any situation where you're following a computer, where it's literally making you move? You're dictating the computer to make me 1,000 cars. Go. That is so different from the person at McDonald's, like, looking like they're actually being exploited because they're going home and there's no way that person is like absolutely healthy. How many it's not the numbers, but sure, let's just say the numbers. How many numbers are tracking that person? This is how I'll go with the argument because it sounds like capitalism, but it's not. Because the numbers are not shown to people when it comes to business and capitalism. Most people aren't aware of the KPI figures or anything like that. The managers will push them. They'll get fired if they tell them anything that's even close to the numbers. Because it's the manager's job to know the number or get told something that stems down from the directors. And at every stage, they are making decisions on what do I tell these people to do to be able to make the shareholders happy, which is all of us. Your argument can be that it's the people at the top. Sure, it's the people with the most amount of money. They're the people who stand the most to lose. But what changes there? Because those people want to win. And those people's money is being impacted by what? Not the fact that you have to slim down not the fact that you have to slim down an expense, and not the fact that you have to slim down the time that it takes somebody to do that. They want to make more money. The way to make more money is to be able to literally do something better. And in the one case of doing a lot, I said very clearly that you just tell a machine what to do. Nobody's being impacted there. So think of that as a takeaway. The machine building 1,000 cars is the one being dictated. We're all sitting there pointing at it, laughing. Build me cars. Where it doesn't get funny is when that thing is pointing at us and saying, we are fired if we don't meet that number. And when that number goes red, you already know that's showing up on a report, and that is being listened by who? By people who are being told this is the way that we solve that problem. Who solved that problem? Because I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have done that. I would have been the manager on duty, or been the person talking to that manager, or been the regional manager, or been the CEO, or been the board of directors who got that information precisely and understood the situation in as short as a sentence saying what happened today. We were enhancing the customer experience. How? That person took a little bit longer than they took yesterday. but it's definitely something good because that customer smiled. When did the data track that? It tracked the reviews. We know those are terrible. Again, another programmatic solution to determine what business is best. You want the best example? I worked at 2 5-star places, and funny enough, the one that I quit had 5 stars and had a union. I quit it because it was the people working there that were toxic, and the ratings that were there were 100% based on the fact that it is a hotel company and that I don't even know how they have 5 stars. But the other business is way better. The food is literally like we have to go to Michelin because the 5 stars doesn't mean anything. The food is garbage at that other place. Like, use that as an example when I say like the rating system is terrible. 2 5-star places, that place is way better. Plus, everybody's way happier. There's no union. There's no I can't help you with this. And if anything, being exploited is when you're put into a task and there's another human being making a bad decision and saying, I'm going to hire one of you instead of two of you to do a 2-person job. That is a human decision. When did the prophet tell that person to do that? Because I can tell you the prophet would say that making that decision is going to make that output terrible. That is not a prophet decision. That is a manager decision. That is a bad manager decision. That's a manager that gets fired if the owner actually knew what the impact of that person is. And I can tell you, as soon as it's not the shareholder's decision, it is a manager. And when it's a manager, it's a human. Because who the hell told that person to do that for profit? No owner, no self-respecting owner who has money that they keep, that continues to run a business. And I can say this because it's important, because anybody who doesn't do that doesn't own a business long enough or in plenty or has enough money in the world, or there's not enough of them to where they're dictating anything more than a couple of businesses in the world. So how can that be an economic system? So what I'm saying is that these people who are set up to be protecting, it's a manager decision, that's a human decision. It's the people that are the problem. And you have to be in a place that's motivating you and a place that wants to work with, because it accepts that problems can be fixed by that human, by me, by showing up to work today, putting in my best effort, and not blaming something external. The way I do that is by taking capitalism arguments and turning them into something that is smaller, that can actually be fixed, because we're not changing the economic system. That's just not what it looks like to me. I've never seen the argument is so simple and it's so basic, and it's the same thing that aggravates people when we talk about things like gender. Any argument based on that filtering and that view is something that is so simplistic that there's so many other confounding variables. If you don't know what that means because you haven't studied statistics, it's that one number is represented by 5, and those 5 are represented by 5 each, and those 5 are represented by 5 each, and that is called confounding variables. And what do you notice there is that by saying one thing, you say something about it all. And it gets a lot of people mad, but it gets a lot of attention, and you can make general statements. How about if you're able to switch the one thing 30 levels down that pyramid branch that I described, and that thing's the problem? That thing could be the manager at that company that I was talking about. You see how serious that gets? Because that person can be sabotaging a whole company by having even a negative viewpoint that they're pushing on a company. Now, if you expand that and we go up that pyramid a couple levels, how about if there's a group of people who are pushing a view and being listened to? that goes as large as you are hiring people who are engineers and agree with you. And that going on too long means so many engineers and people who view the same thing are holding those positions. Sounds like a headache, right? Because we almost think that that could be happening sometimes. And how do you change that without telling people don't do that, like this article did? Well, you need to show something more valuable. And what I'm saying is that that data that you're tracking to solve a problem called profit, there's no profit in. Where are you profiting? Last time I checked, almost every one of these companies has a return rate on it that is so small that you're going through radical developments to be able to show returns. Number two, where is the McDonald's companies that are built on actual companies instead of just processing facilities for chips? Where's the product instead of the thing that's being built that just replaces what? I don't see more excitement in the world. I mean, there's more exciting stuff in the world, but it's starting to look like a processing facility. And sometimes it's easy to get ahead in the argument, and this is why I'll leave it here, because when you get ahead in your own arguments or you start talking in a certain direction, then it can then you can just be jumping ahead. We're learning this stuff. My view on this article, though, and my biggest thing that I can leave people with is, instead of capitalism can't have my creativity, engineering can't have my creativity. But look at it. What do you think can't have your creativity? What do you think the problem is in there, in that pyramid of nodes or confounding variables? I'd be very much interested to hear that. You can find me on X talking about algorithms. Maybe I'll be banned one day from there for saying something totally normal. Right now it's Kevin Nordio, KevinNordio 3. So that's the number 3. And you can chat with me on there. You can also find the Point 5 podcast. Episodes are releasing every 4 to 5 days, 4 days usually, and always have guests on there. And yeah, that's where you can find me online. And make sure that you follow the podcast here, because this is the place where I, expand into discussion on stuff that I read that's relevant to articles. And you can look at those articles and see how people are taking them, and then look at my discussion. And the cross reference of that should be able to provide you a unique perspective. You could literally just trade my perspective and then write it as a comment on there. You might find value just in doing that, because I'm not doing that. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a fantastic day. And hopefully I took something that could have been polarizing and turn it into something that is a manageable conversation between all of us who are interested in things. Bye.